All right, welcome back everybody to the deep dive. We're going to be getting into a really, really big one today. Universal Basic Income. UBI, the big one, the one everyone's talking about these days. And wow, you guys really sent in a ton of stuff for this one. I mean, everything from some hardcore economic studies to like some fascinating historical examples. Oh, and also some really thought-provoking philosophical pieces, which I always love to see. So our mission today, we're going to try to sift through all of this, find those golden nuggets of information, and try to really understand what a UBI could mean in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one thing that you might have noticed right away, just glancing at all this material, is that this concept, it's gone by a bunch of different names over the years.
Yeah.
You've got basic income, you've got minimum income, guaranteed annual income.
Mm-hmm.
They all kind of float around out there. But it's really important to remember that they don't always mean the same thing.
Yeah, and that can get confusing.
Right. Like when you see something like minimum income, a lot of times that's actually attached to certain conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you got to demonstrate need, that you're below a certain income level. It's called means testing.
Mm.
And guaranteed annual income has also often been linked to those sorts of things. Like there was a time when people were talking about a negative income tax.
Right.
That's an example.
Right.
So it's not just like free money for everyone. There are strings attached sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a really key distinction with basic income as we're looking at it today, at least in most of this material. Like, it's really about simplicity.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just this regular cash payment, same amount for everyone, no matter what you do. You don't have to prove that you're poor. You don't have to have a job. It's just this, like, baseline.
Absolutely. A foundation, yeah.
A foundation to build on,
Exactly.
whatever your situation is. And, it's kind of fascinating to think about all this in the context of what's happening in the world right now. I mean, a lot of these readings really paint this picture of some pretty dramatic changes in the global economy, like, that old idea of this balance between capital and labor,
Right.
the returns on investments and property versus wages. It seems like that's really gotten out of whack.
Yeah. I mean, you hear people talking about a second Gilded Age now. This idea that more and more of the wealth, you're going to this smaller and smaller group of people who own stuff, rather than just working for a living.
Yeah, and that creates a lot of anxiety, doesn't it? I mean, for people who are feeling like they're getting left behind.
Absolutely. It's this feeling that the system isn't working for everyone, that the rules are rigged. And, when you have that kind of widespread economic insecurity, it's understandable that people are going to start looking for big solutions that might shake things up a bit. And then, of course, on top of all that, you have the climate crisis, right?
Right. Like this huge looming threat.
Exactly. So when we're talking about UBI, we're not just talking about economics. We're also talking about what kind of society we want to build, how we deal with these massive challenges that are facing us, like climate change.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts here. What is UBI exactly?
So at its most basic, a UBI is a regular cash payment. It's unconditional, meaning no strings attached, and it goes to every single individual in a given community or country.
Okay, so regular meaning like...
It happens consistently, like
Yeah.
monthly or something, not just a one-time thing.
Right.
And unconditional is super important. It means there are no requirements to get it. You don't have to have a job. You don't have to be looking for work. You just get it.
Okay, and it's individual, meaning like...
It goes to each person, not to households or families or anything like that. Everyone gets their own payment.
Gotcha. And why? Like, what are the main arguments for doing this?
Well, there's a whole bunch of arguments out there. One of the biggest ones is just basic fairness. The idea that everyone deserves some level of economic security just by virtue of being human. And a UBI would provide that, right? It's a
Right.
safety net for everyone, regardless of your circumstances.
Yeah, so it's like an ethical argument.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about ensuring that everyone has a certain level of dignity and the ability to participate in society.
Okay. What about like broader societal benefits? Do the readings say anything about that?
Yeah, a lot of them argue that a UBI could lead to a more equal society, which could have all sorts of positive ripple effects. They talk about things like stronger democracies, more tolerant communities, a greater sense of shared citizenship. The idea is that if everyone has a basic economic floor, it could reduce social tensions and create a more cohesive society.
Interesting. And what's really fascinating to me? Some of these readings actually bring in religious perspectives on UBI. You don't often hear religion and economics talked about together.
Yeah, it's not the most common combination, but it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, a lot of religions have teachings about helping the poor and caring for those in need.
Right.
So some people see a UBI as a way to put those principles into practice on a societal level. They argue that it aligns with ideas of justice, compassion, and ensuring everyone has a basic level of security.
Okay, so ethically, it seems like there's a pretty strong case for UBI. What about the political side of things? The readings mention some pretty different viewpoints there. Like, what about the libertarian take on UBI?
Yeah, the libertarian perspective is interesting. It's actually quite divided. You've got some libertarians who see a UBI as a way to shrink the government and increase individual freedom.
Okay, how so?
Well, they argue that a UBI could replace a lot of the existing welfare programs, which they see as inefficient and bureaucratic. So instead of having all these different programs with complicated rules, you just have one simple system where everyone gets a check. And they believe that would give people more control over their own lives and reduce government interference.
Interesting. But not all libertarians agree with that, right?
No, definitely not. You've got other libertarians and a lot of people on the left who are really wary of this approach.
Why is that?
Well, they worry that it's a slippery slope. Like if you replace all these existing social programs with a UBI, it could actually make people worse off.
Right, if it's not enough to cover basic needs.
Exactly. And they also worry that it would undermine support for those programs in the long run.
Okay, so there's definitely some tension there. But it sounds like, at least according to a lot of these readings, a lot of the people who support UBI these days, they see it as working alongside those existing programs, not replacing them entirely.
Yeah, that's definitely a common thread in a lot of the more recent stuff. And it makes sense when you consider how much the world of work has changed. Like, a lot of those older social safety net programs, they were designed for a different era.
Right, like back when people had one job for their whole lives.
Exactly. Back when you had stable long-term employment. But now we've got so much more fluidity in the labor market, more part-time work, more gig work, more freelancing. And a lot of the traditional benefits, like unemployment insurance, they just don't work as well for people who are bouncing around between different jobs.
Right, and it seems like there's also a lot more anxiety about job security these days.
Absolutely. Even if you have a good job, there's this sense that it could disappear overnight, thanks to automation or outsourcing or whatever. So people are looking for something to give them a bit more stability, a bit more control over their lives.
Okay, so the world of work is changing and our old systems aren't keeping up. And then, of course, you throw technology into the mix.
Yeah, technology is a huge part of this conversation. I mean, even if robots aren't taking all our jobs just yet, there's no denying that technology is changing the economy in a big way. And for a lot of people, it feels like those changes are happening too fast, too much at once.
Right. And some of those changes aren't benefiting everyone equally, are they?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
There's a real fear that technology is actually widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Okay, so we've got this changing world of work, we've got rapid technological advancements, and a lot of people are feeling anxious about their economic future. So where does UBI fit into all of this?
Well, some people see UBI as a potential solution to these challenges. Like, it could provide a basic level of economic security in a world where work is becoming more unstable and technology is rapidly changing the job market.
Okay, but let's be realistic here. How could we possibly afford to give everyone free money? I mean, that's got to be a huge cost, right?
Yeah, the cost is definitely a big question. And it's something that needs to be carefully analyzed and debated. But some of these readings actually push back on the idea that affordability is the main issue.
Really? How so?
Well, they argue that even if UBI could be shown to be financially feasible, there would still be a lot of opposition to it. So they suggest that sometimes the affordability argument is actually masking other concerns.
Okay, so maybe it's not just about the money, it's about something else.
Right. Like maybe some people just fundamentally disagree with the idea of giving people money without any strings attached. Or maybe they're worried about the potential impact on work incentives.
Okay, fair enough. But even setting those arguments aside, how do you even begin to calculate the cost of something like UBI? I mean, it's not just about the amount of money you're giving people.
Absolutely. You have to consider all sorts of factors, like the size of the population, the cost of living in different areas, the existing social safety net programs.
Yeah.
And you also have to think about the potential economic benefits of UBI, like increased spending and reduced poverty, which could offset some of the costs.
Right. It's complicated.
It's very complicated, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay, so the cost is a big question, but it's not the only question. And speaking of questions, here's one that I've been thinking about a lot. You know, all this talk about UBI, it often focuses on paid work, like people having jobs or not having jobs. But what about all the unpaid work that people do? The stuff that doesn't show up in the official economic statistics.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it's something that a lot of these readings highlight. The amount of unpaid work that people do, especially women, is absolutely massive.
Right, like childcare, housework, elder care.
Exactly. And it's not just those traditional caregiving roles, it's also things like volunteering, community organizing, even just helping friends and neighbors. And all of that work is essential to society. It has real value.
But it's often invisible.
Exactly. It's invisible in our economic measures, and it's often undervalued in our society.
Hmm.
And a lot of the people who do this unpaid work, they're struggling financially.
Okay, so how does UBI connect to this?
Well, some people argue that a UBI could actually help to recognize and value this unpaid work. Because if everyone has a basic income, it gives people more freedom to choose how they spend their time. They're not as pressured to take on low-paying jobs just to make ends meet.
Right, so they could have more time and energy to devote to those unpaid activities that are important to them.
Exactly. And it could also help to level the playing field between those who do paid work and those who do unpaid work. Because right now, the people who do paid work are often the ones who benefit most from government policies and social programs.
Right. And it's not just about the work itself. The readings also talk about this idea of a right to work in the context of UBI. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's an interesting angle. The traditional way of thinking about the right to work is that everyone should have the right to a job. But the readings argue that UBI could actually expand that right.
Okay, in what way?
Well, they suggest that a true right to work should include the right to choose what kind of work you do, whether it's paid or unpaid.
Right.
And a UBI could help to make that possible, because if you have a basic income, you're not as beholden to an employer. You have more options, more freedom to pursue work that's meaningful to you, even if it doesn't pay a lot of money.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the potential benefits of UBI, but before we get too carried away, we need to acknowledge the challenges. I mean, there are a lot of practical questions about how UBI would actually work.
Oh, absolutely. Like, how do you determine the right amount of money to give people? How do you fund it? How do you prevent fraud and abuse? These are all really important questions.
And then there are the potential downsides. Like, what about the argument that UBI would discourage people from working?
That's a common concern.
Yeah.
And it's something that's been studied a lot. But the evidence is actually quite mixed.
Really?
Yeah. Some studies have shown that UBI can actually increase labor force participation because people are more willing to take risks and start their own businesses.
Okay.
But other studies have shown that it can lead to a slight decrease in working hours, particularly among people who are already working long hours.
So it's not a clear-cut issue.
No, definitely not. And it probably depends on a lot of factors, like the amount of the UBI, the design of the program, and the overall economic context.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about those practical questions in a bit more detail. Like, how do you actually design a UBI program? What are the key considerations?
Well, one of the first things you have to decide is who gets the UBI. Is it truly universal?
Meaning everyone, no matter what.
Yeah. Or are there some exclusions? Like, what about children? What about immigrants? What about people who are already receiving other forms of government assistance?
Right. That's a lot to think about.
It is. And then there's the question of how much money to give people. Is it enough to cover basic needs? Or is it just a supplement to other income sources?
Yeah, and how do you even define basic needs?
Exactly. That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have to figure out how to pay for it.
Right, that's the big one.
And there are a lot of different ideas out there, like raising taxes, cutting other government spending, or even printing more money.
Okay, so there are no easy answers here.
No, definitely not. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations and really think through the implications of UBI before implementing it.
Okay, so it's complex, it's challenging, but it's also potentially really transformative. So where do we go from here? Like, what are the next steps?
Well, one of the things that a lot of these readings emphasize is the need for more research.
Okay, what kind of research?
Well, we need to study the effects of UBI in more detail. Like, what happens to people's lives when they get a basic income? Do they work less? Do they invest more? Do they start their own businesses? Do they become more politically active?
Right, those are all really important questions. And how do we answer those questions?
Well, one way is to conduct more pilot programs, like the ones that have already happened in places like Finland and Namibia.
Okay, and what have we learned from those pilots so far?
Well, the results have been pretty encouraging. Generally speaking, people who receive a basic income report feeling happier, healthier, and more financially secure. And there's no evidence that UBI leads to widespread laziness or decreased work ethic.
That's good to hear, but those pilots were pretty small, right?
Yeah, they were relatively small and short term. So we need more data to really understand the long-term effects of UBI.
Okay, so more research is needed. What else?
Well, we also need to have more public conversations about UBI. Like, what are the potential benefits and drawbacks? How would it affect different groups of people? What are the ethical considerations?
Right, it's a big societal conversation.
It is. And it's one that we need to have together.
Okay, so let's get that conversation started. What are some of the key questions that we need to be asking ourselves?
Well, I think one of the most important questions is what kind of society we want to live in. Like, do we want a society where everyone has a basic level of economic security? Or do we want a society where people are constantly struggling to make ends meet?
Right. And if we do decide that we want a more secure and equitable society, is UBI the best way to achieve that?
That's a good question. And there are definitely other policy options out there, like job guarantees, expanded social safety nets, and more progressive taxation.
Right. It's not the only solution.
Exactly. But I think UBI deserves serious consideration because it has the potential to address some of the most pressing challenges of our time, like poverty, inequality, and the changing nature of work.
Okay, so it's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's also an incredibly important conversation to be having. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into UBI. We hope it's given you some food for thought.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and engaging in these conversations in your own communities.
Because ultimately, the future of our society is up to all of us.
Exactly. It's in our hands.
So let's keep thinking, keep talking, and keep working towards a better world for everyone.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
See you next time.